Hello everybody and welcome to this first video in a brand new series on Animal Farm by George Orwell. Everything I go through in these videos comes from Mr. Bruff's Guide to Animal Farm, available in paperback, Kindle form and ebook form as well, so follow the links in the description to pick up a copy. It was written by Kerry Lewis, aka Mrs. Spag on Twitter, and it really is a complete and brilliant guide to this text. So in today's video we're going to talk about the author George Orwell, and whenever we're looking at biographical details about a writer, we only want to look at details which will help us in our understanding of the text itself. So that's what we're going to do today. George Orwell was born in 1903 and died in 1950, and actually is not called, or was not called, George Orwell. His name was Eric Arthur Blair, but he wrote under the pen name of George Orwell. He was a novelist, an essayist, a critic and a journalist who was born in British India, where his father worked in the civil service, and when Orwell was 1, his mother brought him and his 2 sisters to live in England. Now, despite the fact that his great-grandmother married an earl, his parents did not own any property and were dependent on the civil service for an income. What this meant was that they could not afford to send him to a public school, by which we mean a selective, fee-paying, independent school without financial support. Orwell was a bright child and he won a partial scholarship to a preparatory school in Eastbourne where he boarded for 5 years. He was a budding writer. He composed 2 poems that were published in the local paper whilst he was at school. But at school, his awareness of the class system increased when he noticed that the richer students were treated better than the poorer ones, and he hated his time at St. Cyprian's and actually successfully won scholarships for Wellington College and for Eton. He attended Wellington in spring 1917 until a place became available at Eton, where he was much happier. At Eton, he helped to produce the college magazine and other publications, and his school experiences developed his awareness of class divisions in society, obviously a topic very important to Animal Farm. When he left school, Orwell joined the India Imperial Police Force and in 1922 was posted to Burma. He'd always been an independent thinker, so he learnt fluent Burmese. However, the better he got to know the native people, the more he felt guilty about his role in a British Empire colony. And in Animal Farm, of course, Mr. Jones and the pigs exploit and maltreat the weak in the same way that some British colonisers exploited and maltreated the Burmese. His first novel, Burmese Days, which was published in 1934, is based on his experiences in Burma and bitterly describes British prejudice and corruption. We therefore see that Orwell did not share contemporary beliefs about the benefits of colonialism. The concept of abusing power is a universal theme, not just one limited to communist Russia, and at this point we can understand why by the late 1920s Orwell considered himself an anarchist, that is, someone who does not recognise government authority. In 1927, Orwell became very ill with a mosquito-borne fever, so he returned home to England on leave and at this point decided to leave the Imperial Police Force to become a writer. The next stage of Orwell's life is described in Down and Out in Paris and London, a fascinating book. I love this book and really recommend you have a read of it if the description I'm about to give you piques your interest. This was a book published in 1933, and in this book, in this memoir, Orwell describes how, disguised as a tramp, he explored the poorest parts of London. He got to know its inhabitants and made notes about his experiences, and then he spent 2 years in Paris where he continued to write, supporting himself by taking low-paid jobs such as dishwashing, which he describes with amazing detail in his book. He also wrote articles about unemployment and the social conditions of the poor, so the theme of poverty was emerging as a deeply interesting subject for him. When Down and Out in Paris and London was published, Orwell chose to publish under the pen name of George Orwell because he did not want to embarrass his family about his time as a tramp. So that explains why Eric Arthur Blair writes under the pen name, or wrote under the pen name, George Orwell. Upon his return to England, Orwell wrote articles and novels, supporting himself with a range of jobs, including teaching, working in a second-hand bookshop, but he continued his occasional explorations described explorations disguised as a tramp and did low-paid jobs that provided material for his writing. At one point, he unsuccessfully tried to get himself arrested in the hope that he would be sent to prison so he could write about that experience. His novel A Clergyman's Daughter was published in 1935, and in 1936 Orwell accepted a commission to write about social conditions in the north of England. He spent a month in Wigan, visiting the poor, investigating how they lived and worked, and he first saw the effects of overwork and hunger that he later describes in Animal Farm. As well as visiting coal mines, he attended meetings of the Communist Party and formed a low opinion of Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists. Orwell's experiences culminated in The Road to Wigan Pier, which was published in 1937. The first half describes his investigations, while the second half is a controversial essay in which he describes his middle-class background and the development of his political conscience. At this point, he considered himself to be a socialist and challenged British attitudes towards socialism. Orwell's political views were so strong that at the end of 1936, the same year he married Eileen O'Shaughnessy, he decided to go to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. We see him here in this picture. And he fought in the Spanish Civil War. He wanted to defend the left-wing Republican government against General Franco, the fascist leader supported by Hitler. In Spain, Orwell fought alongside members of an anti-Stalinist movement. He saw active service and survived being shot in the throat by a sniper. When he was in Barcelona, the situation began to deteriorate as Soviet-backed communists began to suppress their political opponents, who included socialists, and the communist press spread lies and propaganda accusing the anti-Stalinists of collaborating with the fascists. And we know that the use of propaganda can be seen throughout the character of Squealer in Animal Farm. Consequently, Orwell and Eileen were forced to flee Spain in fear of their lives, and Orwell's experiences in the Spanish Civil War and his disillusionment with the Communist Party are described in Homage to Catalonia, published in 1938. Orwell now hated any form of totalitarianism, socialism, communism or fascism, and these views form the underlying ideology of Animal Farm and his final novel, 1984. When World War II broke out, Orwell was declared unfit for military service by the medical board because of the condition of his lungs. So, from 1941 to 1943, he worked for the BBC's Eastern Service, countering Nazi propaganda, and it was around this time that he started to write Animal Farm. In November 1943, he became literary editor of the Tribune, and his literary output as a journalist became prolific. He wrote numerous reviews and articles. So it's at this point that we can appreciate the significance of the political context. We already know how Orwell's life helped to shape his views, and that Animal Farm was an attack on the Soviet regime. British politics of the time also impacted on Orwell's life. Initially, publishers refused to accept Animal Farm, a fairy story as it was called, because the Soviet Union was a war ally. And in 1945, the year the war ended and Eileen died, the novella was finally published in the UK. A year later, it was published in America and became an immediate success, increasingly so from 1947 when the Cold War began. So now a well-known writer, Orwell mixed journalism with contributions to literary magazines. He worked on his last and possibly most famous novel, 1984, which was published in June 1949. Suffering from tuberculosis, Orwell married Sonia Brownell from his hospital bed in October 1949 and died 3 months later at the age of 46. So I hope you found this video useful. Lots of interesting details related to Animal Farm. Please do subscribe to the channel and pick up a copy of the revision guide.